Good afternoon, everybody. I'm Jayatri, Chief Bioscientist at the Franklin Institute, and welcome to our next conversation in our ongoing series, Future of Health. These conversations are an opportunity to talk about what's coming next in the world of health and medicine. And we're lucky to be joined today by Tamika Hayden, who is the Site Technical Director of a GSK manufacturing facility outside of Raleigh, North Carolina. Tamika, we're so excited to have you with us today.
Thank you.
And
Glad
this
to
is
be
a
here.
really special conversation for us too, because one of the programs that we've been doing this summer with kids is something called Be an Engineer. And we've been looking at all different kinds of engineering with kids this summer, looking at some of the more expected places you find engineering, like structural engineering, building bridges and buildings and things like that. But also some places where we don't necessarily think about engineering, and biomedical engineering is one of those. So for those out there who are joining us as part of the summer engineering program, welcome. Those of you who are just joining us for the conversation, we hope that you learn some inside information about how engineering applies to health as well. And please send us your questions. Put your questions in the chat, and Tamika and I will be happy to answer them as we talk about her work and her visions for the future. So Tamika, actually get started by learning a little bit about you. What got you interested in the type of engineering that you do?
Well, I've always had a real interest in math and science, and I'm particularly interested in how things work, how things are made. I used to say my goal is to learn how to make just about everything, and I've had a really great career. I'm starting out in the paper industry, making toilet paper, paper towels, napkins, all of the Amazon boxes that everyone's been receiving for the last 16 months. And then I moved over about 16 years ago into pharma. And so it's just, I love seeing how things made and transforming, one input process and then coming out as another output. That's always particularly interested me. And then a love for chemistry. And so if you kind of put all those things together, kind of chemical engineering kind of came out the back end in terms of my area of interest.
So that was one of the fascinating things that I learned about you as we were getting ready for this conversation. Certainly thinking about paper and all of the different places that we use it was not a career that I had been familiar with. And then thinking about how that translates to making medicines and drugs was a leap that I hadn't thought about before either. So when you think about those like just two phases of your career, what's similar and what's different between making things like toilet paper and cardboard boxes to making the kinds of drugs and medicines that you work on now?
Well, it's just as you said, it's very, very different. But I mean, paper making or making paper and pharmaceutical processing or manufacturing are all applications of chemical engineering. And essentially, like I was talking about earlier, it's about transformation. So you've got an input, a raw material that's going through some process where it's going through some sort of transformation, whether by heat, pressure, time, etc. And then something comes out the back end. So and if you think about it in that kind of big picture perspective, it's the same. I think the other piece is automation. Automation is a big part of making paper, and it's a huge part of making pharmaceutical products. So if you think about any industry that has to survive now, you have the need for engineers, automation engineers, not just for to ensure that you have quality product, but just to make sure that you have an understanding of all the various parameters and different things that go into making a product. So that's the other thing. And then I think the last piece is, everything has some sort of raw material. So something's made from something. And so if you kind of put those kind of a broad box around it from that perspective. There are similarities, and you can kind of think about it the big picture because you're making something, whether you're making paper or you're making an actual drug. You're making something that we as a person, as a human being, interacts with, and that's what makes it so fascinating.
Yeah, that's really interesting. And I want to come back to that issue about automation that you raised. But before we talk about that, I think it'd be helpful for us to understand a little bit about the type of work that you do in your role as in managing production. So we were saying before, like this is the worst question to ask somebody, but we'll do it anyways. What's a day in your life look like when it comes to your current job and thinking about how engineering actually goes into making these drugs and medicines that we rely on?
Sure, sure. So I'll start talking a little bit about. So I have a team of people that report to me, and I'll talk a little bit about the people on my team because I think what they do is probably more interesting than what I do some days. Because I do spend a lot of time in meetings, but as a process engineer, that's another similarity. You have process engineers in the paper industry, and you have process engineers in the pharmaceutical industry. You spend an incredible amount of time on the floor, hands on with the product that you're making and the equipment that it takes to actually make those transformations. So a big part of your day would be to come in and look at any data associated with the product that was made on that piece of equipment last night. How did it go? Did anything go wrong? And if it did, generally you're going to probably immediately go onto the manufacturing or operating floor and talk to the operators and figure out what happened. And then depending on what type of engineer you are, what part of the process, you may be doing some work, some sort of maintenance work where you're actually making some modifications or changes to the machine. There may be something wrong with the actual materials that were being put onto that piece of equipment, and you maybe end up doing some more digging and fact finding with that. So you do a lot of running around kind of between the manufacturing floor and up in the office, looking at data, trialing out different things. So you might end up doing some experimentation to figure out what went wrong, or if nothing's going wrong, you may end up doing work to try to improve your processes. So I think being an engineer is fascinating because it's not all in the office. It's really hands on. It's not all in the laboratory either. So nothing against people that are analytical chemists or anything like that work in the lab. But I think being an engineer gives you kind of that mix because you sometimes do laboratory work, but you can do work on the floor, and so it's kind of that great combination of work at your desk, work on the floor, and work in the lab as needed.
And so, I know GSK makes a ton of different products, but can you talk, a little bit at a high level about, the types of products that you work on?
Sure, sure. So I work at a plant that makes both oral solid dose or tablets and then also respiratory products or what everyone would know as inhalers. So we make products that are chiefly in terms of our oral solid dose portfolio for the treatment of HIV. That's something that the site is particularly proud of, or what the company really GSK in terms of our innovation in HIV medicines. And then the company and its legacy companies are well known for its respiratory portfolio. So we make Ventolin, and then we also make Advair, which is probably the two most well known products. And then also our new respiratory product is Ellipta, and so we have a whole platform or portfolio around those. So really two kind of tiers in terms of our oral solid dose products, and then two types of inhalers that we make at the site. Kind of an older generation, the standard inhaler, press and puff kind of thinking, and then the more new technology, which is our multi-dry powder inhaler product.
So let's I'd love to ask you a little bit more about that because I think this is, as we think about, the future of health, thinking about how some of these products that you are working on right now have advanced from where they were, 10 years ago, 20 years ago. That's really cool. So, I mean, talking about HIV first, we started out in the 80s as a disease that, that had no treatment. And now we're at a place where you're making tablets. Can you walk us through kind of like how that's changed, in the manufacturing side?
Sure. So I think changes in the manufacturing side, I think, or where I'll talk a little bit too about more about where we're going. So I think if we've classically made tablets to treat HIV, but now where we're going and where the company is going, we don't make it at the site I work at, but we do make a product that was recently launched that's a long-acting injectable that essentially reduces how many tablets going from tablets to an actual injectable, reduces the amount of product that someone has to take on a day, going from a day to a week or maybe a month. And then those people, if you think about where HIV medicine has went, you think of a person that might have had very no life or very short lifespan once they found out that they had HIV, which then went to AIDS. Now you have people that are living every day with HIV, and the medicines that we make are essentially a person would not be able to give someone else the virus because of their viral load is so low, and so, or non-existent almost. And so the fact that medicine can do that and that we make product that can actually do that is an incredible piece of work, and something that I think anybody that works at the site or for the company for that matter is particularly proud of.
Yeah, and it's such an amazing example of how, science and engineering really go hand in hand, understanding the biology of how the virus works, how it affects the body, and coming up with the medicines to, to fight the virus is part of it. But then, as you're saying, the engineering that, that really improves the quality of life is also such a huge part of it. And so that's, I think that's a piece of it that I think sometimes people take for granted. And maybe you can talk a little bit about the advancement in the inhaler technology as well. Like, what's different between, that puff inhaler versus this new generation that you have?
So if you think about it, the classic, or what people, oh, sorry, what people classically know about inhalers, and thinking about that, the meter dose inhalers actually uses propellant. And if you think about where the company is going in terms of sustainability, we have a goal that by 2030 that we will be net positive in terms of our impact on the climate. And you think of moving from inhalers that use propellant to those that are multi-dose dry powder inhalers that do not use propellant. And so that whole impact in terms of greenhouse gases, that's non-existent. So you think about just a different, for the same thing in terms of a respiratory drug, but now developing engineering technology that moves away from propellant based to actually dry powder. And so that's when you think about that, that's what's so incredible, and that's what engineering does. So all of that, to move to that technology, is about what an engineer does. And so and continuing, that's where I think, if you think about the advances in healthcare and biomedical engineering, so not so much thinking about the classical chemical engineer, but kind of what you see now is students getting a chemical slash biomedical engineering degree. That's really taking advantage and moving the direction of science and engineering in the direction of the innovative technologies in terms of grasping the science, whether it's cell and gene therapy, or trying to make sure that we are not impacting the environment in a negative way.
I think that's so cool, like all of those different facets of the process that you just talked about, how they're all intertwined. So, we talked about, okay, so there's the biology of how to, improve someone's health. There's the, like this engineering, kind of how we think about it traditionally in terms of building a device or something like that, whether it's the manufacturing or the inhaler itself. But then also the footprint of it, like you're saying, that everything that we make is also part of the biggest supply chain of our world, and thinking about that too. So it's really fascinating to me how what you do kind of brings all of these different threads together and how it impacts our lives in kind of ways that it's easy to understand and then in ways that we don't even think about. So I want to, we have a question from the audience here. What are some products that you would like to see in the future to help people manage their own health?
I think where we're already going. So the company is moving in the direction, like I said, of cell and gene therapy, and then immunology, which is basically utilizing our own immune systems to help defeat disease. So I think products such as that that's kind of moving in that direction and taking advantage of what our body already has to offer, because our bodies are like the best machine ever. You can't, that's the best example of a bioengineered product is the human body. And so if you really think about where we can go with that, I think we can utilize it to solve or finally crack the nut of some of those long, historically chronic diseases that we've had trouble actually finding disease targets for, or actual medications or medicines that will actually work effectively in the long term.
Yeah, that's so important. I think one of the cool things that I'm seeing also is that, as you mentioned the importance of getting all of that data, especially of thinking about how our bodies can respond to different diseases. The more data we have, the more we can develop treatments for rare diseases as well. So I think with respect to that, we can just help more people as we go down that path.
Agreed.
I wanted to circle back to the point that you brought up earlier around automation, because that's certainly something that we're seeing across the engineering industry in lots of different ways. What does that look like, for the kinds of processes that you oversee? What are some things that might have been done by people 10 years ago, or, I don't even, I'm speculating now because I don't know for sure here, but I'm hoping you can help us understand this. Because this is an issue as well that people are thinking about, like, what are the jobs of the future going to be?
So I think I can answer that in two parts. So I think the first is you don't necessarily, so you can go kind of to me in two directions, where you're a process engineer, but then you can end up being a process control engineer also, where you can actually work directly on the equipment and actually make sure that the equipment always runs the way it should. But to talk about some of the things that's the art of the possibles is, if you think before in terms of our detection or vision systems, and looking for defects and or catching defects before it could happen, we're actually doing some work like that now in our MDPI or multi-dose dry powder inhaler area, where we're utilizing SAS, which is basically a program, and we've basically developed a model where a vision system where we can actually detect defects before, kind of in a way, and then utilize it to remove defective devices off the line before they would end up being released, going into an actual finished product. And then let's say you find out about it after the product has actually been tested and packaged and tested. Then you would have to, let's say, break all that product down and rework all that product. Well, if you can figure that out preventively before it actually gets further down to the end of the process, and not have a small army of people doing 100% vision inspection. And you can imagine people are probably one of the worst. Well, no, actually, people are kind of pretty good at being a vision system, but obviously there are better ones out there. So utilization of models and different things to be able to solve problems. That's an example of kind of automation. Doing a lot of work to actually improve products and improve pieces of equipment to make them more precise. So if you think of our devices, for example, they are many machines, and so they have very tight tolerances. And so automation to enable us to be able to make sure that our product and our processes are not getting out of alignment. So, that's a, I would say, very simple or elementary example, but I mean, it can get even more complicated than that. And so use of automation to help us to deliver products more robustly, right first time, every time. That's kind of one of our values in terms of what we come into work to do every day.
Yeah, so that's really fascinating. So it's really putting in these extra layers of control to kind of catch problems before they get bigger. And we're really seeing that at such a large scale as we're learning more about how COVID vaccines, for example, are being developed. And we're hearing about sometimes there are problems in the manufacturing, but these systems are in place to kind of catch them. So that's really interesting in terms of how that technology is advancing. Which again, I mean, I feel like every time you explain what you do, there are layers of engineering that are just stacked on top of each other, and so many different angles to think about as our health technologies get more advanced. Thinking about all of the systems that have to be in place. To actually get that medicine from, from where you are to where somebody with asthma might actually just need a puff of that inhaler.
Exactly. Yep.
So as an engineer, we know that I think one of the things that machines can't do necessarily is solve problems all the time. So that's where humans still come in, right? So what's one of the biggest challenges that you've had to solve?
Um, a little bit of pre-work. I thought about this one, and the problem is all problems seem like the most challenging when you get that problem. I think I can reflect on a recent problem because the role that I'm currently in, I've been in for almost a year now. I think what makes problems challenging working at a manufacturing site is that they are time sensitive, because every minute that you're not sending product down the line and ultimately out the door, that means that there is a product that's not getting to a patient. And you think of what we've experienced the last 18 months and how critical, especially when you think about respiratory devices or people getting HIV medicines, to think about the implication, because something's a challenge or a problem has happened and you can't figure out how to solve it right away. I think the other piece, and this is a recent example, is when the problem happens that's out of your control. So if you have, as probably a lot of people have experienced, delays, you order something and supplier issues. Well, we've experienced the same thing too. And some of the supplier quality hasn't been that great. And so as a result, you've ended up finding a problem. We recently found a problem, and not only being new in the role, I had to learn more about the process. But then at the same time, I'm learning we have to figure out how to solve this problem. So we've got to figure out what is the nature of the problem or the defect that we're seeing. What's the root cause of the defect? What's the defect rate? Whether or not the defect will show up as something that the patient could or could not see, and then what's the implication of that? And all of that is time sensitive. So that's where the challenge comes in, because it would be great if you had like 6 months to solve this problem and figure it out, but really you need to solve this problem in less than 6 days or in a few hours if possible, which is generally not possible to solve a problem that quickly because it's so complex. But I think that's where the challenge comes in, because you've got a lot of people depending on you to try to figure out what the issue is and how to fix it as soon as possible. And then if you can't fix it quickly, what are the interim solutions that you can get in place so you can get things going again?
That's such an important reminder that in the kind of work that you do, it's not just like time and money that's on the line, right? It's actually
Yeah.
getting medicines to people who need it. So that the stakes are so much higher. So,
Yeah,
as we think
exactly.
about the future, you know, what do you see as the role of engineers in where health and medicine are moving forward?
Well, I think everything that we've talked through so far, it feels like, which actually I hadn't really reflected on this too much, that engineers are going to be even more important. So if you think about, like we just talked about in terms of sustainability and improving and reducing our carbon footprint and making the things that we currently make and we have been making for several years, making them more sustainable, reducing the amount of waste and impact on the environment, that's something that engineers would do. That's an engineering function. And then you think about our new products and new innovation. You've got an idea or you've got a thought, and then you put the science behind it. But it takes the science in terms of developing or identifying a disease target, and then translating that into how to an actual functional product that someone can take, or some sort of biomedical engineering. That's where engineers will reside. So I really think a big part of the future of healthcare will be in the engineering space, because in order to keep up with the pace of the world, we have to develop and engineer new innovative solutions. We have to be able to tie in better, some of the stuff that, Google or whether it's big data or Facebook, or, you've got to be able to better integrate all of that into how do we industrialize that into the medicines that we're taking. And so I think engineers, not just chemical, but all types of engineers are going to play a big part of that, and are going to be a lot more visible part of what healthcare looks like than what they've been in the past.
Yeah, I think that's a really interesting area to think about. As technology is advancing, and especially as technologies become smaller, there are new ways of thinking about how to integrate them with our bodies. We're already seeing all these different kinds of wearable technologies that even that some of the Olympic athletes are wearing that we're seeing in the last couple of weeks. Again, to think about how we can monitor our health, and how we can respond in ways that, again, just are almost seamlessly fit into our quality of life. So I think that's a really cool place to think about. You've also talked about where we can look forward to developments in health and medicine that keep us from getting sick in the first place. Where do you think there's opportunity there?
Well, I think it's a part with partnering with, well, I think it's two parts. I think, the vaccines obviously play a big part in that, so as we've seen in the last 18 months with COVID, but also, other vaccines, whether it's for shingles or meningitis, or a vaccine for, upper respiratory disease, or whatever. But I think the other piece in terms of just health and wellness, I think one of the things that connected to work, but all engineering, but also just overall workplace health, I think that's also a big piece of where I think healthcare is going. And so healthcare companies also are getting, I don't want to say in the business, but are more intent on their employees and thinking about their health and wellness, and then how that relates to the work that they do every day. And I think you're going to start seeing that more integrated kind of health and wellness, in addition to the work that we already do in terms of developing medicines for patients. And I think that's where you're going to kind of see the future go, in terms of companies kind of partnering in that way, but particularly healthcare companies, because it's so much a part of what we do and what our value proposition is.
Yeah, and then the last thing that I wanted to circle back to is another thing that you mentioned earlier, is the idea of cell and gene therapies. And as you mentioned, a lot of this is looking at how we can really take advantage of the body's own systems of protecting ourselves. But obviously that's something that can be very individualized from person to person. So what does that mean in terms of how we move forward with developing out this technology? Can you talk a little bit about, why it's so important to get, different people involved and why we need lots of people to be involved in this research?
Sure, sure. I think, well, one, if you think historically, in some ways, we cracked, we have medicines available for what I'll call the commonly known therapeutic areas in many cases. I think if you really think about oncology, though, you think about cancer, that's an area that's so individualized, and the patient populations for certain types of cancer can be very, very small. And so that's where I think cell and gene therapy is going to be so critical, because that's the way that I think the traditional way of medicine development is not going to work, to, as we've seen, to crack, some of these, very serious and rare diseases. And so I think that's why it's so incredible how the science is meeting the moment almost in terms of where we're going. And then I think ultimately wrapping it back to engineering, I think it's about taking where the science is and then translating that into an actual product in terms of what it looks like. And I think that's the piece that's going to be so incredibly fascinating to watch over the next 5 to 10 years in terms of where it goes and where it gets us in terms of the science.
Yeah, I think you raised a really interesting point there, is because again, it's where like the engineering and the health come together, right? We know that, there are diseases that affect different populations differently, whether it's because of different genes or, differences in our environment. But then we also know that, when we think about how to make medicines in a way that make it easy for people to take them. There are so many differences in, in where people live and what they have access to. And this is why we need so many engineers from so many different backgrounds, because there are so many problems to solve, right?
Exactly. There's no lack of stuff to do for sure.
And so I guess I'll circle back as we close here, asking you to think about your own story. You mentioned to me that you were the first in your family to go to college. What does it mean, for you to pursue this career in engineering, and what do you hope that your experience can help you share with kids who might be thinking about becoming engineers someday?
Well, I think the key thing is don't give up on your dreams. Just because you're the first in your family to do something, whether it's, because I'm really one of the only, I think I'm the only engineer also in my family, and there are not a lot of female chemical engineers, relatively speaking, if you compare it to other things that might be you might see more often. But I think if you have a real passion and enthusiasm for math and science, there's so much that you can do with an engineering degree. You're not limited by certain things and areas where you think engineering may not apply. They really do. And if you really, it comes down to fundamentally if you love to solve problems. That is, my title is site technical director, and I'm a chemical engineer. But if I like to think of myself as a problem solver, that's what gets me up every day. I love to solve problems. It makes me excited. The harder the problem, the more excited I get because I get to learn something. So I think engineering is great if you are a constant learner, because there's no way that you can learn everything there is to know about anything. There's so much, and as soon as you think you do, something new comes out and you kind of got to start all over again. And so I think I'm hopeful that we will see more, kids move forward into getting interested again in STEM programs, and really focused on science, because science is so fascinating, and not to feel that you're limited by certain areas. You can You can work anywhere and it will take you anywhere. So you just get the opportunity to travel and to see so many places, see so many different places and learn so many different things. And so it's just been an incredible ride thus far. And I really love being an engineer.
Well, thank you, Tamika, for taking all of us on a on a trip into your world today. I think it's really fascinating, how you've shown us, we think about health, really in at the end of the process that you've laid out for us, but there are so many complexities along the way that you've shown us from, the sustainability and the impact of the whole process, how to make, medicines work in a way that is not just effective, but also convenient for people because that's so important. And then also just the time and the care that goes into the quality of the medicines that we take. It's just really cool to see how that is advancing along with the biology of the medicines themselves. So thank you for opening that window for us today. We really appreciate you joining us for this conversation. And for everyone listening today, I hope you learned something about engineering and health and thinking about where that will take us in the future. And we hope that you'll join us for future virtual programs here at the Franklin Institute and visiting us in person as well. Thanks, everybody. Have a great afternoon and take care.
Thank you.